Good afternoon and welcome to the Gleason Public Library. We're very happy to welcome back Dr. Gary Hylander, who's spoken here a number of times before. And this talk is presented with Sage Educational Services and is sponsored by the Friends of the Gleason Public Library and the Friends of the Carlisle Council on Aging. Enjoy.
All right, here we go. Well, good to see everyone. And what do we have here? Maybe 150 people in the room. What a great turnout, and thank you. Thank you all for coming. And we've got quite a show here. We've got a 2-hour conversation on the Cold War. Now, the Cold War is a 15-week course, with 6 books, midterm and a final, and also probably a term paper. So I know you didn't sign up for that. So what we're going to do here, and this will be an extraordinary achievement if we can pull it off, is to condense, 15 weeks of conversation into 2 hours. So what I'll do is I'll just talk fast. How about that? And I always told my students, I'll talk fast and you listen fast. They never know what to make of that, which is okay. It's always good to keep the nippers off balance. Well, it's been a long time, since we've been together, and I hope that this situation passes and we can get back to our old normal. I don't like the new normal as well, and one of the problems I have, and I have it in here, is trying to talk through my mask, and I cannot. And it's hard for people to hear me, and more importantly, as importantly, for me to hear them. So what we're going to talk about this afternoon is, and I'm going to skip around, so if I interrupt myself, everybody, it's because I'm filling in a little bit, because I may have overlooked a piece of the Cold War. So in 1945, the hot war became a Cold War. And the question for us, or the question obviously that people who teach history consider, was the Cold War inevitable? And I don't think that it was. And that, personalities had a huge role in this, and also ideological differences. So I'm going to hold those 2 thoughts for you, and I'm going to hold those 2 thoughts for me, as we begin to transfer and begin to move from a hot war to a Cold War. And that transition, one of the transition moments militarily, at least, is when Harry Truman chose to, bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki to force a Japanese surrender, which was very difficult for them to do. And as you've heard me say in another context, as the emperor, got on the radio and did 2 things. He relieved the Japanese subjects of their personal loyalty to him, and also that we must accept, as he said, we must accept the unacceptable. I wish I could do that for you in Japanese, but I cannot. That we must accept the unacceptable. In other words, being defeat. And also I'd like to point out, and this is just a broad statement here, that not only did Truman bomb Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and hear me well please, that he also bombed Moscow. And by that I mean, that he wanted to intimidate Stalin. Look what we have, and you better watch your step. Look what we have here, and drawing his pistols, bang Hiroshima, bang Nagasaki, and then reholstering them. Look what we have here, that you do not have, and this helped us set in some ways, the stage for the Cold War. Stalin was not intimidated at all. And what he chose to do instead was to begin his own atomic project. And the stage for this decision was set with what was called the Operation Paperclip. And that Stalin, and that's the title of a book, Operation Paperclip, in which Stalin and his KGB had identified, those German scientists, principally physicists, that he would draft. And Operation Paperclip, it's simply that the names of certain prominent German physicists and scientists Their names were placed in folders, manila folders, and a paperclip, literally placed on it. This is our first round draft choice, our second round draft choice. If we can get these guys, before they flee to the West. And Truman and his science advisors had the very same program, Operation Paperclip. These are the guys we want to draft and bring to the United States. And their number one draft pick, and I'm just going to be brief here, their number one draft pick was Wernher von Braun. And he helped to put Neil Armstrong on the moon. So this is the military start of the Cold War. The political start, the rhetorical start, was when Harry Truman, and by 1946, for Harry Truman, and for American advisors, it was quite clear, that Stalin was turning all of Eastern Europe into a prison colony, into a gulag, quite clear. And Truman knew this, and Truman was going to respond rhetorically. Well, he will over time, but the rhetorical announcement at the beginning of the Cold War was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill being voted out of office, and Harry Truman inviting Winston Churchill to come to the United States, to come to Fullerton, Missouri, to be given an honorary doctorate, and then to speak, about the new real, in Europe, in Eastern Europe anyway. And he described what was going on, and read the speech. It's a good speech. It's a good warning, if you will. And in that warning, he used the term, the Iron Curtain. The initial draft, read the Iron Wall. But Churchill didn't feel that was strong enough. So an Iron Curtain has descended across all of Eastern Europe. And all of Eastern Europe is being turned into a gulag, into a prison colony. Just a little bit of a spoof here. Stalin's foreign minister was Foreign Minister Molotov. And Molotov's wife found her way into the gulag. Now, what I don't know is whether or not Foreign Minister Molotov approached Stalin and asked him to change his mind. And I don't know. And maybe Molotov, who enjoyed all the benefits of the Communist Party, may have said, no, I really don't want to interfere here, and let her stay there until she served her time. I don't know whether or not he said that, but I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't, because I've got all the benefits of being a member of the Communist Party and foreign minister. So this is the starting point, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and rhetorically the Iron Curtain speech. Stalin objected to this speech mightily. He felt that it was a declaration of war, and a rhetorical declaration of war. And I'm not here to be an apologist, for the Soviet behavior, but just to put this in some perspective, at the end of World War II, and you all know this, Russia was terribly beat up, at the end of World War II. And what Stalin did is that he cut his military to about 3 million men. And the Russian military, at the close of the war in Berlin was 12, 13, 14 million people, soldiers, we'll never know. And he also, cut his military budget to half of that of the United States. Now you can do with that what you like, but Stalin trying to send some sort of a guarded message here, that Russia, has been terribly beat up at the end of World War II. And hold that thought, because I want to bring it back into your memory bank when Eisenhower offered the Open Skies proposal. So here is Truman, the first president of the Cold War, the first president of the atomic age, a man who certainly was not happy suddenly to be president of the United States with all of these political and social and military considerations. And Russia, Stalin acting up in Eastern Europe. And for Stalin acting up, what a thin phrase. For Stalin imposing his rule on all of Eastern Europe and the KGB. And there was a message, and here's a message I want to share with you, that Stalin, and it's a message all of us will understand here. When Stalin returned to Moscow he placed all of the nations under his control on Moscow time. Now, to do that, you have to have some juice, don't you? And for Stalin, when I pick up the phone in Moscow at 3 p.m., I want it to be 3 p.m. in East Berlin. Now that's juice. I mean, that's having some clout. And as we know for Stalin, he was always very suspicious. You know, did not accept fools lightly. And as Stalin said, replicating Lenin, revolutions without firing squads are ridiculous. I need to eliminate all my opposition. Stalin was mentally ill. He was paranoid, mentally ill. He was certainly paranoid. Yet he had the authority. He had the fear. He worked the fear. And he stayed up late at night indicating who would be executed that week or maybe the following morning. Truman caught on to Stalin. Truman had met Stalin at Potsdam. And that was one of the major post-war conference of World War II. And initially, Truman liked Stalin. He thought he was an honorable guy, a straightforward guy who told the truth. As Stalin always said, I do not like algebra. It's too confusing. He said, I like arithmetic. 1, 2, 3, 4. I've reduced my army down to 3 million men. I've cut my military budget in half as compared to you. He said, I prefer arithmetic. Not the confusion or the dissembling of algebra. And I think that speaks to, how Stalin viewed the world. It is numbers, and who are my foes and who support me. Truman always knew this. Truman would say that the only thing Stalin respects is the number of divisions that you have on the ground. And I think he borrowed that line. I know he borrowed that line from Stalin, who many times would say that the only concern I have for the Pope is how many divisions can he put on the ground. Numbers. And of course he knew that number. None. It was all not the military, the Christian influence of being the Pope. How many divisions can he put on the ground? And that's how Stalin measured things in a very arithmetically way. Stalin held on to all of Eastern Europe as a buffer. Stalin believed that sooner than later that the Germans would come back, that there would be another war. And even though Hitler was dead, that the Germans would be back again, and maybe with the assistance of the British. And I need to keep all of Eastern Europe as a buffer, so that here's Moscow. And if I keep all of Eastern Europe, beginning with Poland, as a buffer, it keeps the enemy away from me. And that's Stalin's point of view, because the Americans are coming again, or maybe the Germans with the English. He didn't know. I need to protect Holy Mother Russia, or the Bolshevik seizure of power. That became clear to Truman. And we were confused at the end of the war, as to how to deal with this properly. And the number 2 guy in Moscow, George Kennan, wrote, and you can read this, you can pull it up online, and he wrote a famous telegram. It's called the Long Telegram. It's 8,000 words. And in 8,000 words, George Kennan, who was an expert, you can read it at a red light. George Kennan, who was an expert on Soviet history, Russian history, and Russian behavior, said it's always been the premise of Russian diplomacy under Peter the Great or Catherine the Great or whomever. Expand, 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 and protect our borders. And in that long telegram, George Kennan, working with later on Dean Acheson and also and those who are planning post-war policy, that what we need to do And this is where the word containment, came into the diplomatic language. George Kennan, the long telegram. We need to contain the Soviet Union and prevent them from expanding even farther out. And he said, if we do this successfully, it will take money, it will take stamina, it will take a stout heart, it will take time. Is that over time, two things will happen. Now, he's being optimistic here. And this tended to be the American policy until John Foster Dulles appeared and offered another alternative. Eisenhower never accepted it. You see, I'm getting ahead of myself here a little bit. I'll come back. I won't lose my place. You can believe that, and you can believe that too. Your name is Margaret. That was my grandmother's name. I could pretend anything. And you're Peter? That was my grandfather's name. Stay tuned. With containment, two things will happen. Either, and the success of democratic capitalism, which will be put in place with the Marshall Plan, will become so knowledgeable to the Soviet people with radio. They can't plug in, obstruct every radio station, and with magazines and so forth. The benefits of liberal democratic capitalism, that the Russian people will want this because they've suffered so immensely, during World War II, and Stalin had reimposed all the restrictions on the Russian people after World War II. They'll either want it, and the communists want to stay in power, so they'll make some effort to provide for this, or there'll be such unrest inside the Soviet Union that there'll be an internal uprising. So he felt the communists, wishing to maintain their position, will give the Russian people something, democratic capitalism, or there'll be another upheaval. He said, but it will take time. And I'm not putting any time limit on it. Containment. And that was a policy. And as evidence of this policy of containment, the best evidence of the workings of containment will be the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was announced in 1947, and it dates, and again I should say, dates are slippery. George Marshall, at the Harvard commencement in 1947, June of 47, announced the Marshall Plan, which was billions of dollars, poured into the nations of Western Europe to help them recover economically. It succeeded enormously within these borders. Now, the Marshall Plan, the monies were offered to the states of Eastern Europe as well. But Stalin brushed their hand away. That's American influence. I don't want that. And it would be Foreign Minister Molotov, to counter the Marshall Plan, who will promise those people in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union what he called the Molotov Plan. Well, it didn't work. Not a single ruble showed up. So the Molotov Plan was simply words. The Marshall Plan was money and helped to restore very quickly the economies of Western Europe. Now, the Marshall Plan followed, or was preceded by, perhaps that's a better word, the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine, and this is Harry Truman, and he was not a man to mess with. Harry Truman was not Franklin Roosevelt in any respect. Harry Truman told the truth. Franklin Roosevelt, the truth was always, well, it can become counterfactual. And for Harry Truman, that we need to do something to counter, to contain, the Soviet influence, as I tried to penetrate Soviet influence into Greece and Turkey. You see, Greece and Turkey were the gateways to the Middle East. Political instability. Oil, oil, oil. And when the British came to Dean Acheson, who later on became Secretary of State to Harry Truman, the two of them got along famously. Two very different men, but they got along very well. That the Truman Doctrine, that we will help to suppress, by monies and by supplies, unrest in Greece and Turkey. Because if Greece and Turkey somehow get absorbed behind the Iron Curtain, that opens up all of the Middle East to Soviet penetration. So the Truman Doctrine was Truman pushing back on Soviet aggression. We need to contain the Soviet menace. And it will be Dean Acheson who will support the Truman Doctrine, who will give an address to Truman's advisors, both Democrat and Republican. And this is a wonderful analogy. At least it works well. And here's Dean Acheson giving the example that one rotten apple in a barrel, you can read the speech, one rotten apple in a barrel over time will spoil all the apples, in that barrel. And if we allow the Soviets to get a foothold into Greece and Turkey, it will threaten the continents of Africa, it will threaten Southeast Asia, it'll threaten all of Europe if we allow that rotten barrel to get in there. So containment, the Truman Doctrine, keep that rotten barrel away. The Marshall Plan, economic recovery, and we need to help them to recover. And again, offering Marshall Plan money, to Czechoslovakia, to Hungary and Austria, and Truman and Molotov, no. It will be the beginning of American penetration, economic and political and ideological. So we have the Marshall Plan. We have the Truman Doctrine. And at Potsdam, notice how I'm moving around. At Potsdam, Germany was divided into zones of occupation. Berlin was divided into zones of occupation. And at Potsdam, and this continued after Potsdam, Stalin wanted reparations for the war. He wanted billions of dollars in reparations to help pay for the war, to help the Soviet Union recover. And Truman said no. Absolutely no. You've already stripped Eastern Europe of all of its capital, all of its merchandise. And we are not going to talk about, reparations at all. And I'm going to protect the future of West Germany and West Berlin. And the best example of this is when Harry Truman, you see, Stalin tried to push the Americans out of Europe. See, Stalin believed that what will happen after World War II is what happened after World War I. The Americans will leave. They'll leave. And I'll be able to move and penetrate all the way to the English Channel. And so he began to put pressure on West Berlin. West Berlin, if you look at the map, you can see this. West Berlin was located 125 miles inside the Soviet zone of occupation, inside East Berlin, inside West Germany. There was no way in except on one highway and by canals. So Stalin blocked the canals, railway access, and also air access. I want to push the Americans out of West Berlin. And if I push them out of West Berlin, which is an American enclave, that the Europeans will no longer trust the Americans will leave, and I'll have my way across all of Western Europe. And Truman said, no way. Truman, we are staying, period. And when the option was offered to him that perhaps we can supply West Berlin by air, and most military advisors said one cannot supply West Berlin by air. The population of West Berlin was half the population of Massachusetts today. You cannot do that. It's physically impossible. And Harry Truman, we'll have round-the-clock air supplies ferried in. And that became known as the Berlin Airlift. And over time, over more than a year, Truman prevailed. And Stalin never mentioned it, but he pulled all of his troops out of West Berlin. West Berlin was saved. We are staying, period. That's Harry Truman. So the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, the Berlin Airlift. And this is Harry Truman. A man from nowhere, but a man very unlike FDR. FDR would never, I don't think, would never have said these things or done these things. That he called Molotov stone ass, and he brought him into the White House. in the Oval Office and said, keep your promises, allow elections in all of Eastern Europe. Keep your promises. And Molotovs, I've never been talked to like that in my life. And Truman said, well, keep your promises and you won't get talked to like that. Yeah, this is Harry Truman. Harry Truman was, without the approval of the State Department, without the approval of George Marshall, who at the time was Secretary of State, recognized the brand new nation of Israel. And he did so because here's a seed, inside the Middle East, a democratic seed that might grow and might help to reform or help to certainly, as I said, a seedling, grow democracy, inside all of the Middle East. I am recognizing the nation of Israel. And Secretary Marshall said, you cannot do this. We have interest, political interest among the Arab states. They have the oil. And Truman said, I'm going to do it. Why? It's the right thing to do. I'm going to do it because the Jews need a place to relocate. They don't want to go back to Poland. They don't want to go back to parts of Eastern Europe. Their memories are too bitter. They're too brittle. They're too bloody. So I will do this. And Marshall said the State Department does not approve of this. We need to support the Arabs. And Truman said, well, I'm supporting Israel. Now, politically, I just want to let go of this. Truman was up for re-election in '48, and he knew that Jewish voters did two things. They contributed financially, and they voted. So there's the domestic side of that as well. So this is Harry Truman, who had failed at everything that he had done. But today, this afternoon, I'm looking at the clock, I know it's this afternoon, that Harry Truman, when he left office in 1952, Harry Truman's poll numbers were lower than those of Nixon, when Nixon left office in August of 1974. Here's my point. Harry Truman this afternoon, he is rated among, by presidential historians, he's rated among the near great presidents, Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, and so forth. You know what? If Harry Truman walked through that door and I told him that, he would dismiss it. I did my job. I did my job as I saw it fitting to do my job. And he would say during his presidency, there are 100 men here in Washington who feel they should be president and can do the job better than me. And maybe they can. Maybe they could have. But it was my job to do, and I did it the way I felt it benefited the United States, both in terms of containing, the Russian threat and also providing for, domestic relief at home. So Harry Truman, in 1952, could have run for a third term. When the 22nd Amendment was passed, and I want to avoid too much of domestic politics, when the 22nd Amendment was passed, 2 terms and you're out, Harry Truman was grandfathered, that he could have run for a third term. He said, I'm going home. I've had it. I'm going home in 1952. Well, in 1952. And with that, Dwight Eisenhower is elected president of the United States. Dwight Eisenhower did not want the presidency. He did not need it. He was already in the history books. But Dwight Eisenhower felt that it was his responsibility. He was a West Point graduate, duty, honor, country. That it's my responsibility to help protect the gains of World War II. No one can do it the way I can do it. And he wasn't bragging, simply that the Soviets are a threat. And no one else knows a battlefield like I do. And we don't need World War III. And he felt confident that he could prevent, World War III. Even though at the end of his presidency, he warned about the military-industrial complex. We're still dealing with that today, aren't we? And we have since the end of World War II. Eisenhower accepts the nomination of his party, and he crushes Adlai Stevenson twice, in '52 and '56. Adlai Stevenson was simply too intellectual, for the American voters to get him. You needed, when Adlai Stevenson spoke, you better have a a thesaurus on the table here. And Stevenson was a good man. It's just that, he didn't resonate, with your American voter. Eisenhower did. I like Ike. We like Ike. And he too could have been elected to a third term, but the 22nd Amendment prohibited that. We heard a little bit about the 22nd Amendment, haven't we? And lately, and we've heard a little bit about the 25th Amendment lately. I don't want to go there, but if you want to have an example, if you want an example of Madison's concept of checks and balances, read the 25th Amendment. It was put on the books in 1967. And when you can figure it out, explain it to me. But it is a model of checks and balances. Eisenhower wanted peace. Eisenhower wanted to prevent a war from breaking out. And in 1953, Eisenhower thought there was a possibility of perhaps diminishing the threat of another war. Stalin died in 1953, March of 1953. So how is this going to affect the Kremlin? Well, he didn't know. And eventually, Khrushchev will become the new guy in following Stalin. And Eisenhower wants to meet the new man. He wants to meet Nikita Khrushchev. Have things changed? Can we diffuse the possibility of a third world war? There'll be no winners in a third world war. And what Eisenhower does is that he wants to meet with Khrushchev. And Khrushchev agrees. I want to meet with Eisenhower. And Khrushchev knew that Eisenhower was a military man. And Eisenhower knew that Khrushchev had served with bloody distinction in World War II at Stalingrad. And boy, was that something, at Stalingrad. And they meet. And now John Foster Dulles, who was Eisenhower's Secretary of State, talked about we can no longer accommodate the Soviet Union. We need to, never happened because Eisenhower knew it might be the premise for war, that Dulles talked about rollback. Containment is accepting the Russian position wherever they are around the globe. We need to roll back communism. Wherever it exists or threatens to spring up its ugly head. Rollback should replace containment. Containment is immoral. Containment allows tens of millions of people, to be suffocated behind the Iron Curtain and elsewhere. Rollback, rollback, rollback. And Eisenhower wanted no part of rollback, but it really played to the voters. Rollback, rollback, rollback. And Eisenhower wanted no part of rollback. I want to meet the new Soviet leader. And Dulles says you ought not do that. Don't even shake hands with him. It's like COVID. It's dangerous. It's dangerous. If you shake hands with a communist, you'll catch it. You've got to wash your hands 5 minutes afterwards, not 20. Don't even meet him. Never mind shake his hand. And Eisenhower said, I want to meet this guy. I sign your paycheck. And Dulles said, well, if you're going to meet him, when you get off the plane, do not get off the plane with a big grin and with this, because you'll be sending the wrong message. And so when Eisenhower got off the plane, he gave a big grin and did this, which made Dulles nuts. What also made Dulles nuts is that Eisenhower brought with him, without consulting his Secretary of State, a plan to defang, or certainly to contain, the threat of war. And what Eisenhower proposes, and this comes as a complete surprise to Nikita Khrushchev and his advisors. One thing about the Russians, whether it's Putin or Khrushchev, is they don't like surprises. In other words, we've got it all negotiated out before we even sit down and talk. All the details have been worked out. Basically, it's a conversation. It's a couple of rounds of vodka. We sign. See you later. Have a nice holiday. What Eisenhower presents to Khrushchev, and Khrushchev's military, who did not trust Khrushchev. They didn't know him. They knew he was a tough guy in Stalingrad. But we don't know him the way we knew Stalin. Eisenhower presents what became known as for the American people. It's a wonderful phrase, a wonderful explanation. It was called the Open Skies Proposal. Open Skies Proposal. And what that meant is that we will allow, Soviet surveillance aircraft to fly over any American naval base, military base, anywhere they want to fly in the United States, and photograph and photograph and photograph. And we are wide open, because we want you to know that we are not secretly planning for a first strike, Armageddon. It's all there. And in return, you will allow us to fly over any military installation, missile installation, naval installation we want to fly over, and film it so we know that you're not planning a surprise attack on us. We're playing poker, and we're showing you our hand. And for Eisenhower, he meant it. And Khrushchev, taken completely by surprise. No. One, I don't know Eisenhower. I know he's a military man. I know that he implemented D-Day, but I don't know him. That personal relationship, that goes back to what we said at the beginning of our conversation. Personalities matter. Maybe they don't matter to Molotov. Keep my wife in a gulag. I can always find another one. Whatever. I always tell my male students, or I tell my female students, don't worry about guys. Guys are like streetcars. They come along every 15 minutes. So don't think the first man that pays attention to you is the guy you have to marry. And the guys get all upset with that. Dr. Hylander. I said, look, guys, women come along like streetcars also, every 15 minutes. Well, okay, as long as it's even Stevens. And then we let it go. We get back to what's on the board, or to what we're talking about. I like to play with them a little bit. It's always good to joke as a teacher, and not always to not always to keep it serious. So, Khrushchev, yeah. Now, why did he say that? I don't know Eisenhower, but what he did know is how weak the Soviet Union was after World War World War II. There wasn't a stone on a stone from Berlin to Moscow, from Berlin to Stalingrad. And if he knows how weak we are, that might lead him to order a preemptive strike. And instead, Eisenhower comes back and in a speech or a press conference or whatever, that I've offered this proposal to the Soviets, and since they've rejected it, I need to steal what they will not share with me. And that becomes aerial reconnaissance of the Soviet Union, which, by satellite, which will help pave the way, for the Bay of Pigs invasion. And Eisenhower, and by the way, Eisenhower, he had seen the Autobahns in Germany, and it's Stalin, it's Eisenhower, who suggests we have an interstate highway system, 95. And for two reasons. One, so that if we have to evacuate American cities with the threat of nuclear war, people can get out quickly. I can imagine all the traffic. And secondly, that we can move American hardware, military hardware, to points that we need to pre-position them in case there might be an attack. When Eisenhower leaves office, the country's at peace, it's prosperous, and I know if I remember, you remember the prosperity of the, at least as white Anglo-Saxons, the prosperity of the mid to late 1950s. Dinah Shore, see the USA in your Chevrolet? Boy, if we just could do a 6-week course on the cultural, social aspects of the 1950s, boy, that would be fun. That would trigger so many memories. So when John Kennedy defeats Richard Nixon for the presidency in the 1960 election. And Kennedy, it's time to get this country moving again. And Kennedy was a Cold War warrior. He accepted all the beliefs, all the strategies of the Cold War. I mean, he was a military guy. I mean, he was a decorated hero, PT 109, decorated hero, from World War II, fighting in the Pacific. More about that if we'd had another course going. And Eisenhower will do two things. He'll have a 15, 20-minute, 30-minute sit-down with Kennedy. Eisenhower wanted no part of Kennedy. He thought he was too young, too immature, and so forth to be president of the United States. He didn't care for Nixon, but he certainly did not care for Kennedy whatsoever. But nonetheless, Kennedy was elected, and this is so traditional that the outgoing president has a sit-down with the incoming president, and Eisenhower tells him, you've got three problems on the international front. You've got three problems. Keep an eye on this. Berlin, all right? Berlin, Laos, and the Soviet Union. You've got three problems. Keep an eye on these guys. He said nothing about any domestic concerns at all. As I said, in the late 1950s, they were fact for most people, if you're white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And then, the evening before, or maybe 2 days before he left the White House, he gave a speech. And he warned about the military-industrial complex. We still talk about that, don't we? And that we need to balance our spending between domestic concerns and military concerns. We cannot become Sparta. And then he leaves office. Before he leaves office, he has another sit-down with Khrushchev, and they get along famously. And Khrushchev invites him, to reciprocate. You've invited me to the United States. I'd like you to come and visit the Soviet Union. Now that invitation will be withdrawn, in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs and so forth. But they leave in a very hospitable manner. And Kennedy wants to put his fingerprints, all over American foreign policy. And that is the lure of the Bay of Pigs. See, when Kennedy took office, he'd been briefed. And he had been briefed that Eisenhower was planning to oust Castro. I mean, Castro was a communist. Castro, was a bad apple, if you will, a rotten apple, in the Caribbean. And this is Eisenhower. And if we allow him to remain and be successful, it could contaminate, it could spread its rottenness throughout all of the Caribbean. So I need to remove him. And Eisenhower had begun to plan with his military advisors and others a plan, it was called Operation Zapata, to oust Castro. Excuse me. But Eisenhower was always cautious. Before I oust Castro, I want to make sure, A, the move is popular, and B, excuse me, that there is a government waiting to take power. I just don't want to remove him without being able to replace him. So Eisenhower was cautious, and he laid this out to Kennedy. And Kennedy was incautious, that he wanted to put his stamp as quickly as possible on American foreign policy. I want to oust Castro. And that became, for us, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. And what Eisenhower did, see, when he was brought in, when Eisenhower came in as, when Kennedy came in as president, he was persuaded by Bissell and others that Eisenhower was too cautious, that we can remove Castro in a heartbeat. So Kennedy looked at the plans, and he wanted to put his fingerprints on them. And he did this in a number of ways, one of which, it'll be a covert operation. We're going to plan it at night. We're going to come ashore at night. We're going to hide our hand. we are going to use local Cubans who have fled with Castro's takeover. They're called La Brigada. The brigade, 1,000 men, coming together, invading at night. And also, we're going to move the attack spot from 75 or 80 miles opposite Havana to down the road a bit at the Hylander, the Bay of Pigs. We're going to hide it. We're not going to use Americans. The men who formed La Brigada were told, or at least they assumed they were told, that once you get ashore and plant the Cuban flag, we're coming in right behind you. And all you have to do is get out of our way. That never, ever happened. You know, melt into the jungles, get out of our way, and in come the Marines. And it was a total failure. Khrushchev was watching this. Now, and he couldn't believe that Kennedy, Cuba is only 90 miles away from Florida, and he couldn't believe that Kennedy would not commit American air power and American ground power to supporting the effort to oust Castro. So when La Brigada came ashore, Castro, put his troops down on the beach and put his military uniform on, has beard, and his hair flowing, and that rifle on his hip. Magnificent look. There were so many women that fell in love with Castro. More than he could count. Coming down on the beach with in the Jeep, with the rifle on his hip, with that military cap on, and leading the assault against La Brigada. As he liked to claim, I am maximum leader. I am maximum leader. And there's no difference between Hitler and Kennedy. Now that really upset Kennedy, both Robert and Jack Kennedy. Comparing me to Hitler, failure, a complete failure. Now Kennedy, got on in a press conference, took blame for this. He accepted full responsibility for this. Kennedy also, when that Berlin Wall went up, he did not do anything, because that Berlin Wall went up to separate East Berlin from West Berlin. The success of West Berlin against the lack of success in East Berlin. That wall was there to keep East Berliners out of West Berlin so they could not see the benefits of liberal democratic capitalism and bring that word back and bring those supplies, bring those materials back to the families, and the word would spread. And this is what Kennedy had proposed. It will take time. So up went that wall. And Kennedy did nothing. And he did nothing to support La Brigada on the ground, on the beaches in Cuba. Now, Khrushchev noticed this. He also noticed something else. That Kennedy, and you can take from this whatever you want, that Kennedy was the age of his eldest son, who was one of his advisors. Sounds like the Trump scheme, doesn't it? One of his advisors. He's a young man, he's a kid. He doesn't know anything. He has no experience in terms of foreign policy, in terms of diplomacy. And Kennedy is about to meet Khrushchev, because Kennedy had planned, and I'm looking for my calendar, my appointments calendar, that Kennedy had already made appointments to meet all the foreign leaders, and one of whom was Khrushchev, and to meet him in Vienna. I think it was Vienna. Yeah, it was Vienna. It wasn't Geneva. And he did not want to cancel it for fear that Khrushchev would see this as weakness, fear. So I'm going to keep this appointment. And Khrushchev was waiting for him. And Kennedy thought, Kennedy did not read fully his briefing books. He thought he could charm Khrushchev. Khrushchev was not a man who could be charmed. I'm going to charm him with my vitality, with my sense of humor, with American gifts to him and the Soviet people. Now, what did Khrushchev know? Khrushchev knew that Kennedy had not responded at the Bay of Pigs. He did nothing about the Berlin Wall. And now I'm going to meet this guy. And Kennedy was not prepared. And Khrushchev was not about to be charmed. And Khrushchev noticed that Kennedy was nervous, and he also noticed, and again, body language is so important, that Kennedy was chain smoking. And every time that Khrushchev got up, maybe to go to the men's room, I don't know, or got up to take a phone call from Moscow, Kennedy bolted out of his chair to shake hands with him again. I've been missing you for the last 30 seconds. A sign of weakness, a sign of fear. Kennedy wanted to talk about Berlin. Khrushchev wanted to talk about missiles. And so they left under not terribly pleasant terms. So when Kennedy came home to the United States, and in a press conference told the press, and by extension the American people, what had gone on in between he and Khrushchev, he said it's going to be a cold winter. And he called up the reserves. And he strengthened the American tank force in West Berlin. It's going to be a cold winter. And it didn't go well. And Khrushchev, he knew it didn't go well, and I'm going to take advantage of this. By the way, anytime any one of you, needs a clarification, and I know you're all taking notes over there, and you in particular, stop me. I'm going to stop anyway at 2 o'clock, take a breather, take a drink here. And Kennedy, meanwhile, is getting reports about, I forgot to mention this, now I'm going to back up for a minute, that in terms of communist aggression, when the Marshall Plan and NATO, which was created in 1949, and the Berlin Airlift seemed to stymie, the Russian advances in Western Europe, the Korean War broke out, didn't it? And if you can just picture, Korea, hangs like the appendix, underneath China, and this is seen as we're being blocked in the West, we're spreading. We need to contain it from getting into Korea, at least South Korea, which we were supporting, and that led to the Korean War, which Truman tried to cover up as a police action, not to use the word war, and to use the newly created UN to try to block it. Now, that's another whole story that will take an hour and a half, but I want you to think that I forgot about when Soviet advances are blocked to the west. Truman and others see it as moving to the east, that Mao Zedong suggesting to Kim Il-sung, which never took place, to invade South Korea, to expand communism from China, into South Korea. It wasn't quite that simple. That being said, MacArthur was put in charge, and that said, we know that eventually Truman will fire MacArthur, relieve him of command. Truman had never met MacArthur, but he'd heard about MacArthur, that he was so self-important. I don't like him. I don't like him, even though I've never met him. Sometimes you run into people like that. What I hear about him, I don't like. And all of it was true. So when Truman relieved MacArthur of command, and there was some talk of running for MacArthur rather than Eisenhower as president, and I'll just leave it at that. I mean, the Korean War, that winter war, was a terrible, bloody, frostbitten war. So here's Kennedy, hearing about communist influence in South Vietnam, and he remembered, how Truman had been so beat up by Republicans for losing China, and then possibly losing South Korea. And Kennedy, I don't want a repeat of what happened on the Korean Peninsula. So when military action, began to erupt, the North Vietnamese attacking South Vietnam, what Kennedy did, he implemented the term counterinsurgency. In other words, we are going to beat the communists at the rice root level. and that became known as the Peace Corps. You know, we are going to defeat them at the rice root level and show American goodwill. And these were young men and women, you know, who went into the hamlets. You know, we are good people. And to inoculate them, to teach them, and so forth. And we're going to beat them with counterinsurgency. We're also going to beat them in the jungle with the Green Berets. It's going to be low profile, low cost to the American people. And we're going to keep it under the weather report. You may know the phrase, below the, what was that?
Radar?
Below the, help me that.
Radar?
Yeah, okay. We're going to keep it off the front pages. And then he's assassinated, isn't he? So I'm going to leave it here.